Welcome, everyone. I'm Monsignor Stuart Swetland, the 7th president here at Donnelly College in Kansas City, in Kansas, and we're very honored tonight to host this important event. But what seems like for the umpteenth time, as an educator and a priest, I have to begin a public event with a moment of silence. If you have not heard, there was a tragic shooting in Texas, southern Texas, where 14 students, elementary school students, a teacher, a grandmother, were killed. I don't know how long we're going to continue to deal with this in our country until we are serious about caring for one another. But at least tonight, in whatever is your tradition, would you join me in a moment of silence praying for those families and those lost ones? Have mercy, Lord. Thank you. Tonight we are talking about a very important subject, what we like to call here at Donnelly College environmental justice. And we are very committed as a college and as an institution to try to live out the vision that our church has on taking care of our common home. We like to talk about Mother Earth. And so I'm going to recommend to you writing, not that I've done, but a boss of mine has done. You might have heard of him, Pope Francis, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, where the vision of what we should do as good stewards of the earth is laid out. And this is accessible not just to those who share my faith, the Catholic faith, but to all people of goodwill. Welcome to Donnelly College. We're the most diverse college in the entire Midwest. I always like to tell people on the East and West Coast, so if you think diversity, think Kansas, because we're the most diverse college in the entire Midwest, because here in this area, we have a wonderfully diverse and I think holy group of young people who are pursuing the truth, doing so in search of a building community and in search of being people who have a calling and live out that calling as they do so with a commitment to excellence. So welcome to Donnelly College, and God bless you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monsignor. Good evening, and thank you to our in-person and virtual attendees tonight. It's great to see faces out there this evening. Many thanks to Monsignor Stuart Swetland and Dr. Mary Flons and the entire Donnelly College community for hosting our event here on their beautiful campus tonight. Really pleased to be here in KCK despite the soggy conditions. My name is Claire Bishop, and as Executive Director of American Public Square, it is my honor to welcome you to tonight's event, The Politics of Mother Nature. The climate is changing, should we? We're going to have a really great discussion tonight, but I wanted to start with a few opening remarks quickly. Those of you who are familiar with American Public Square may recall that it is our mission to bring the community together to address polarizing and often contentious issues with civility, facts, and multiple perspectives. Our founder, Ambassador Alan Katz, started APS in 2014 after seeing so many situations where people of goodwill came to different conclusions based on the same set of facts. He intended this to be a forum for our community to do more than shouting one another down over disagreements, a place to practice disagreeing not less, but better with one another. We have been proudly serving this mission in Kansas City now for 8 years. Tonight's program, addressing the role of corporations and consumers in climate action, is an example of just the type of polarizing issue that warrants such an approach. Rather than solving this issue, we hope to end the program with increased understanding and respect for one another. We are truly grateful for the time and energy our panelists, who you will meet in just a moment, have committed to this conversation. Before we get to the program, I wanted to make a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, our gratitude goes to our sponsors for tonight's event. We have an anonymous contributor that we'd like to recognize, along with Donnelly College, the Health Forward Foundation, Ogletree Deacons, the Patterson Family Foundation, the Seidler Family Foundation, John and Marnie Sherman, and the William T. Kemper Foundation, who support our digital fact sheet, which I hope you all have on your phone or mobile device. APS employs several tools to ensure that our conversations always stay civil and fact-based. I'm going to tell you about a couple of those now just before we get started. We are pleased to provide you with access to a digital fact sheet about tonight's topic. The link to the fact sheet can be found on the event page of our website, americanpublicsquare.org. And for those of you online, we will put the link in the chat. I want to give a little shout out to audience member Chris LeBeau, who helped us put that fact sheet together. I see her in the audience, and she deserves a little shout out too. We do have live fact checkers here, and we welcome requested fact checks and questions for our esteemed panel. So fact checker over there on my far left, your far right. That is Jensen Adams, Energy and Sustainability Officer with the Kansas City Public Library. The process for submitting a question or a fact check is going to be the same. If you're live and in person, you'll notice that your seat had one of these on it. On one side it says question, on the other side it says fact sheet. You can fill out your question or your fact check, raise it up, and a volunteer will come around and gather it and share it with our panelists in our group. That way, we keep it from, we don't open the question and answer to audience members specifically. And that's another request that we have for in-present audience members. One of our other tools that we employ is that we ask you not to comment or clap during the program. That helps it keep things civil, and we're not talking for a reaction from the audience, and that just helps keep the temperature down, I think. And another quick note, yes, it's a little different, but it seems to work. Another quick note is that we didn't have enough pencils for everybody, so if you find yourself with a question and a card, but nothing to write with, give your hand a raise and we'll bring you over a pen or a pencil, okay? Let me see. If you are attending the program virtually, we've got a lot of folks who, due to weather or other circumstances, are joining us virtually tonight. We're so happy to have you. Please use the Q&A function please use the chat feature of Zoom for your question and answers, or for your questions. We'll get those in. Lastly, do we have civility bells? Oh, ding, ding. Okay. And do we have audience members that have civility bells? I think someone near the front ought to be Marty. You can have one. Okay, anyone want to volunteer to be our civil? I can explain the job. Oh, there we go. We got it. We got one. I love it. That's our own Ian Hammer, by the way. Ian, you're the bomb. Okay. I think oh, great. You probably know this, but I'm going to just give a little outline for audience members. You do have an important job if you've got the bell. If you sense the conversation getting heated or moving toward incivility, and I can actually assure you that this is quite rare at our events, but it does happen time to time, give the bell a ring just like this. That is a sign for everyone to calm down, take a deep breath, and sort of reconnoiter themselves before the conversation continues. So you have to be on the lookout for crazy behavior from these guys. All right, so those are all the housekeeping items I had. Again, delighted to have you all here. Thanks again to Monsignor and to Donnelly College. I'm going to hand it over to Marty Rosenberg from Flatland News, who is our fantastic moderator tonight. He'll be introducing you to our esteemed panelists. Over to you, Marty.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for acknowledging the history of this organization. I'm pretty impressed with what Alan Katz has done. I had a chance to talk to him in Portugal. He's in Portugal right now, and his vision for this organization is fairly unique, given the problems our society is facing. You know, I heard the news about that school shooting this afternoon, and in addition to my stomach dropping, I thought, we have the luxury of talking about climate change when these problems are so massively popping up all over the place, that we may not last this century to get to the problems that a lot of our scientists are talking about. You know, there are two ways of thinking about this nice audience that's assembled on a rainy, cold night here in Kansas. Couple of things I've found out about this organization and the changing media landscape is in 2020, they have had upwards of 20,000 people attend these programs around the country. My role is really not with Flatlands, I freelance for them, but I run a podcast for the Department of Energy called Grid Talk. And if you want to find it, it's called smartgrid.gov/Grid Talk. And I started out as a reporter at the Kansas City Star. I've run national energy magazines and national energy conferences. Chuck has appeared at some of those conferences. But it's pretty interesting about this podcast that we've had over 40,000 downloads since I launched it. And when I wrote here, I was read across Kansas City. When I wrote for these energy magazines, I was read by energy executives and workers around the country. But my podcast is being read, it's on the future of electricity in the world, in remote outposts in Sri Lanka, Australian outback. I get all the stats on where people are listening to it. It absolutely blows my mind. So I take a bit of solace from that fact that there are thousands of people that are listening to programs like this, alongside the problem we're going to talk about of people basically being in tribes, talking to themselves, and not reaching out to encounter others that have different views. We have a really interesting panel here. I have to start with Dominique Davison by virtue of one fact. There's one woman in this room, at least, that I know that has been a punk rocker. And she has toured the world and performed. And now she founded and runs an organization called DRA. And it's an architectural firm here in Kansas City that has about 13 professionals and addresses sustainability and design. You're going to tell me where the clean design is. But I'd like you to address one of three questions that I'm going to throw out to the panelists to get everybody warmed up. If you've looked at the excellent fact sheet that this organization prepared for the panelists and for you to get everybody grounded on the same page, in the intro there was a quote from Brian Head about three things that we really have to focus on as a society. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk about one. And I'm going to ask you, Dominique, the need to reduce industrial pollution. Why is that important?
I'm sorry, it was a little bit hard.
The need to reduce industrial pollution.
So industrial pollution, along the way that I think about greenhouse gases and the relationship with air quality and public health and all of that is the way that we've thought about it in terms of the building and construction industry is industry, transportation, and then buildings are the three biggest contributors, or kind of, you can lump it all sort of into those three categories. I know the most about buildings, right? And so those contribute about 40% of the total greenhouse gases. Industry is about 30%, and transportation is the other 30. You can fact check me on that. So absolutely, industry is, a critical piece of that overall puzzle. It gets rather complicated in terms of, how you put different things into those different quadrants. But the building and construction industry absolutely has to do a better job of reducing our 40%, which is the biggest pie piece there, by, one of the things that we could be doing is going on right now with Kansas City, Missouri, and the adoption of the new IECC code 2021 that is under debate right now, and just improving the building codes so that everybody is required to put in more insulation and better quality systems that protect our indoor air quality as well as lower the energy usage of those buildings. It's just a common sense thing that will make huge impacts.
Thank you. Next, we turn to Chuck Caisley. Chuck is Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Chief Customer Officer of Evergy, the dominant utility in this region. Chuck has been with the company since 2007. My history with the company goes way back, further than that. I don't know if Chuck knows this, if I ever told him, but the reason I came to Kansas City is the Star had a big news story that was breaking about Wolf Creek nuclear plant. And Kansas City Power and Light then, I think, was looking to raise its rates 52% to pay for it. And the Star didn't have anybody that knew how to write about energy, so they hired me. So I've had the luxury of knowing your company back from the days of Art Doyle, virtually every CEO since then. And I want to talk to you about the corporate culture and how it's evolved, but have you address the second major issue that Brian had said has to be addressed, the need to manage scarce resources. Why is that important?
Wow, so Chuck Caisley from Evergy, and hello, Mother Collins, good to see you. So hopefully audience interaction's okay, but it's been a long time since I've seen that dear lady. You know, look, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to most folks whether or not, whether or not you are a climate change advocate or not, you can very easily see that we're not making fossil fuels as quickly as we're consuming them. So we're going to have to make an energy transition. I think it's funny sometimes when you hear elected officials and others say, well, we're going to keep doing this, we want to save this and we want to do this forever. Well, no, you're not, because it is going away one of these days. And so I think what's interesting is that I think technology has advanced enough that there are so many good technologies and ways to power our lives these days, and whether it's automation that helps people schedule when they do things, whether it is clean generation, whether it's the changing nature of where generation is located, the way we consume and the way we generate electricity and deliver it is changing. But it's not a question of if. That conversation is really over. It's a question of when, how fast, and how to maintain reliability and affordability while you do it.
Thank you. And our third panelist is James Taylor, president of the Heartland Institute, which advocates for limited government and for private sector solutions to our problems. Is that fair?
That's correct.
So, James, the third point raised by Brian Head is we need to protect biodiversity and ecological systems. Why is that important?
Well, I think that the most important takeaway from that admonition is to look at how we can do so, and particularly regarding the global warming issue and debate. If you look at what's going to have impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, I'll cite to you a peer-reviewed study by Harvard University scientists published just a few years ago, and they believe in a climate crisis. And they said to replace conventional electricity with wind turbines, how many wind turbines would we need? And what they found is that you would have to carpet literally 1/3 of the American landmass with wind turbines to replace conventional energy. And if we electrify transportation, which so many people advocate, now literally half the American landmass would have to be carpeted with wind turbines. When I was growing up, being an environmentalist largely meant being a conservationist. And certainly if you are going to be a conservationist, that's going to have benefits for ecosystems and biodiversity. And I worry that by taking our eye off the ball of what's most important, we're going to bring some tremendous environmental damage to this country. I can't think of anything more damaging environmentally as a whole, but particularly regarding ecosystems and biodiversity, is if we have to be leveling forests, destroying places where animals, plants thrive and survive, and taking half of that off the map. So I think it's important that we look at all the issues, and that's one of them, certainly.
Does anybody want to comment on anything that's been said thus far? And Madison, do we have any comments from the audience? Anybody? We'd like you to write it down, please, and hand it to her. And I'll go to my next round of questions while we're waiting for that.
Do you want to go?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, completely agree with you that the first thing we do should not be to cover the globe with wind turbines. That was a study that just looked at, if that was the only solution. And one of the things that we really look at DRAW, and all architects, I think, at this point are really focusing on this, is reducing first, right? What do we do to reduce the total load on our energy systems, which would then, of course, reduce the number of renewables that we need to use. And there are a variety of different kinds of renewables we can be using. We can be doing geothermal, we can be doing solar, we can be looking at a smarter grid system that could reduce the load by as much as 25% if we really manage our energy much better. So I think it's the response is, what are the collective solutions that can be used appropriately in the right places in order to achieve the goals that we have to achieve in order to avoid a complete and total climate crisis, which we are already in.
And I just like to add on to that. I think it is. It's an all of the above kind of a thing as we transition from what has been a centrally designed, centrally made, and distributed out system to a system that is more, that's just cleaner and smarter. So just a couple of things. I agree completely with the study, by the way. If you electrify all the transportation in the United States, and that's all you do, you just put that load, that increased demand on the system, that's going to be a problem, because what we're going to do is right now we manage to peak consumption, which in this area is 3, 4, 5, 6 o'clock on a July or an August time period. And so what we do as Evergy is we design the system, both the generation that we have and the system, the transmission and distribution to deliver it to your home or your business, to meet that demand for what is a needle peak. It's about 4 hours in the afternoon. But that means that the grid, both the generation and the transmission and distribution, 80% of the time is less than 50% utilized. So think about that just from an economics perspective. We have invested and built a system, because no other technology existed, that is designed to be underutilized most of the time. So what good looks like isn't just electrification. That's part of it. But what good really looks like is charging when there is tons of electricity on the system and enough capacity to deliver it. That becomes like the price line of the electrical grid. Some of that is demand response. What does that mean? That means, when we talk about conservation, that word conservation is interesting because, it's first kind of like Jimmy Carter, and it was in an energy crisis, maybe a little bit like what we're having today, and conservation meant use less, get less. When we talk about energy efficiency, when we talk about demand response, we're saying get the same thing that you want, charge your car, have air conditioning, but let's use technology to schedule it at a time where it's cheaper for the grid, or it doesn't cause us to exacerbate or increase our peak demand, making us build more. We can add billions, trillions of kilowatt hours to our system, and that's Evergy's, that's Board of Public Utilities, that's every utility across the United States, where they have tons of capacity that just isn't being used because they had to build the system to peak. And so it's really an all of the above thing, and the technology exists today to start doing some of that. It's just deploying it in scale and helping people understand how to change what they traditionally haven't thought about very much.
So Chuck, that's called time of day rates, and there are parts of the country that have it already. One of the questions in our fact sheet is, the climate is changing, has the climate change urgently changed the behaviors of corporations and individuals? I'm a proponent of the belief that complex approaches sometimes work. So I'm going to ask you a question that's going to put you on the spot, and then I'm going to throw you a softball. The question that I'll put you on the spot is, What do you think the responsibility of Evergy is to get Missouri and Kansas regulators to allow you to have time of day rates? How hard are you working for it, and when can we expect it?
So we already have time of use rates in Missouri, and Kansas. Hopefully next year we'll get some time of use rates. In Missouri, for those of you who live in Missouri, it's called Wait Till 8, and you get a price break for waiting till 8 in the summertime. It is a blunt instrument, honestly, because most people, when they go to wash their dishes or do their laundry or charge their car, they don't want to wait. And so it is a very small group of people right now that actually are willing to make that sacrifice, and to make that sacrifice for what adds up to be maybe $3, $4, $5 in a given month for folks who really have a lot of electrical usage. Where I think what good looks like is time of use rates, but time of use rates that interact with your house, that interact with your business, that interact with your vehicle, and it sends a signal that says, you can set the parameters of when it's less costly, automatically charge my car. So for example, I drive a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. I go into work, and the first thing I do is plug it in. If, however, there was a price differential, I'd use this wonderful little thing right here, and I'd say wait till the price is the cheapest during the day that I'm at work and charge it then. And at that same time, when is it going to be cheapest? Well, it's going to be cheapest when Evergy says there's a lot of excess electricity on the system. For many folks at home, that's going to be overnight, when we have a ton of wind blowing in western and southwestern Kansas, and it's really cheap delivered electricity. And so set your laundry to go at 2 o'clock at night, because that's what your smart laundry machine can do. That may seem a little George Jetson right now. Some of the younger folks in the audience may not know what that is, or maybe just got a glimpse of it on YouTube. But
You can remember him.
hey, touche. But it's not. The technology is here now, and it's going to keep purveying. And I couldn't agree with Dominique more, which is if we update our codes and kind of demand some of those things as part of standards for building, you're going to see it come even quicker.
Dominique, do you want to jump in? And what could be done? You're focused on design. How can we design this so it takes off really fast?
There are a couple things. So we also have a sister company called Planet Impact that is software that actually does a return on investment analysis for different levels of efficiency, and both for energy and water for a project. So we can look at it and say, okay, well, if you invest in the better systems, in the better building envelope, or more water efficient system, how much can you expect to save, and what is the incremental cost for that update, right? So what's your ROI? And we've been using that in our practice, and it's pretty clear that the investment is, it varies on building type, right? But it could be anything from maybe a 5% increase on an industrial project to maybe a 25% increase on a more kind of civic type project. It depends. But the fact is that that investment absolutely makes sense long term for any kind of project in terms of the ROI.
So James, you look like you have a little scowl on your face. Are you okay with all this?
Oh, no, it's not a scowl. It's me deep in thought. But the economist in me says that it's a fantastic idea. We should be using more energy when more of it's available, when there's less demand. From an economic standpoint. The civil libertarian part of me says, well, now we have these outside entities that can see when I'm doing this, when I'm doing that. I personally don't have a problem with that. I personally would sign up for that. I wish that we had a system whereby the utilities are not government created, government protected, and we're assigned to them. If we had true freedom of choice in the marketplace, then people who are concerned about privacy issues, well, then they could sign up with a utility or choose a plan for which they are not getting charged by time and demand. They'd probably pay a little bit more, and they'd sleep a little better at night. So what I see really here is that the heart of the problem is that government got involved and created and is enforcing a system where we don't have choice. And I think choice would solve that.
God bless government. Dominique, I want to ask you a question, though, and that is getting towards complexity. We assume innovation on housing stock is happening in California and Massachusetts. But if you go down, as you know, to Second in Delaware, one of the most energy efficient apartment complexes in the world has been built right here in Kansas City. Talk about the reality and the business forces and the market forces that allow that to be created, how it's working, and what the implications are.
So Jonathan Arnold obviously developed that project with his team, and I'm actually standing in for him tonight. So he would be able to speak much more eloquently and intelligently about that project. But it is built, it is leased, it's successful, it's doing very, very well from what I understand in terms of its performance. And what they did there was build it per passive house standards. And something really, really critical that I actually want to tack on to what I was going to say with the previous comment and relates to your previous question is they included the utility costs as part of the rent. So instead of necessarily saying, okay, well, here's your per square foot rent, and then you're going to pay your bill separately, right? The utilities are included in the overall cost. So for them, they're able to charge a kind of utility rate that's based on the market, but in fact, they're paying a lot less. So their per square foot rent cost is quite a bit higher. So it's a really, really smart method and something that we've actually found in our work that can be an inhibitor to building more sustainably or more efficiently is that
Specifically how that works is because the house is energy efficient, the actual energy costs are lower than average.
Correct.
And the developer can use that revenue to offset the cost of the rents.
Right, and the increased cost to build it. So, and I think that's something that is would be really great to see, especially in the commercial office market, if leases started being calculated to the lessor, to basically include the utility costs, then building owners would be incentivized to be a lot more efficient with what they're doing. Because now what we hear a lot is, well, we're going to pass that cost on to the renter anyway, so why would we increase the cost of construction in order to make it more efficient for money we're not going to recoup? So that's just a very simple thing that could be renegotiated through a lease agreement and make a massive difference.
So, Chuck, you're probably waiting for your softball.
No, actually, Marty, you want to cut in here. We've got a couple audience questions.
Okay.
Do you mind if I go for it?
Go ahead.
Okay, everyone. So we've got quite a few here, but we're going to be jumping back a little bit because this is kind of in relation to the earlier conversation about wind turbines. And this person says, Wolf Creek Nuclear supports 19% of Kansas power. And the audience member says that this uses about 10,000 acres, equivalent to about 8,800 wind turbines. So the question is, where do you all stand on nuclear energy?
Do you want to start?
Sure. Where I stand on nuclear energy is about where I stand on all energy sources, and that is it should be allowed to compete unfettered with other energy sources, and those that are most efficient, reliable, are going to prevail. Nuclear power is regulated much more than others. Certainly you have the potential when you're dealing with uranium, et cetera. Today's reactors are much safer, basically foolproof, but regardless. When it comes to how it compares with other sources, if I'm just to play observer from up high, we know that coal and natural gas are much more affordable than nuclear power. Nuclear power is more affordable than wind and solar, and then we can factor in other factors such as environmental issues. But let it compete.
Do we want to run a fact check on that, please? Did you
I'm
hear that?
interested to know, I'm curious if you let them compete without any federal subsidy at all, what would the numbers look like? I'm just curious, because there obviously is a lot of subsidization of gas and oil and nuclear.
Right. And I'm so happy you brought that up because the Energy Information Administration has tracked the amount of federal subsidies specific to electricity source. And that was done under the Obama administration in 2013 and 2016, I believe. But what they found is that wind power by itself receives more federal subsidies than all conventional energy sources combined. Solar power by itself receives more federal subsidies than all conventional energy sources combined. For me, regardless of who was getting more subsidies, I agree that we should not be subsidizing any particular form of energy production. I'd love to see them all go away.
So a point of information from our fact sheet, which is relevant here, that there was a Yale climate opinion poll in 2021. And I didn't look at the methodology, assume it's well done poll, if it's cited in our fact sheet. 72% of the respondents said global warming is happening, and a Pew study said that 79% feel alternative sources of energy should be a priority. So I think that has to be factored along with cost, because as everybody knows, particularly economists, cost comes down with deployment. And so a lot of these technologies are different arcs in their evolutionary path. But I'd like Chuck to respond to some of the points James did raised about subsidies.
So first, obviously Wolf Creek is our nuclear power plant, and we're still operating it, and so it's something obviously we support. It's emission-free. It hasn't had so much of a blip in terms of reliability or safety since it came online. It does take 10,000 acres, but the vast majority of that is buffer zone around it, meaning keeping people out, and you know, most people don't want to have a nuclear plant right in their backyard. In addition, most of our power plants that exist today have that, and what we are using it for largely right now, in fact, we're doing it right now in our Hawthorne power plant in Kansas City, Missouri, is we're starting to put up solar in all that buffer zone that's otherwise unused, and it also takes advantage of an interconnect to the transmission system. Think of the transmission system as the interstate highway of the electrical grid, and allows us to put that electricity on where we already have essentially a highway made. Having said all that, when you talk about the cost of electricity, I believe it is absolutely true. I don't need to fact check it that wind is getting the most subsidy these days. I do think a couple things are relevant about that, and in particular for Kansas and Missouri. One is that, as Marty, as you said, they are in a different technology arc, right? Wind, as good as it has gotten over the last decade, is still you know, a relatively new technology at this level, and it's getting better and better every day. I do think there's going to be a day when it won't be subsidized anymore, and for its profile will be competitive with fossil fuel or with nuclear. And it is true that once you put it in the ground, that electricity, other than a little bit of maintenance on those turbines, that's free electricity, right? So that it is something that because coupled with government subsidies, and that once you're done with that first in cost, that capital investment, it is actually something that pushes downward pressure on our customers' rates. So that is true. The flip side, though, is, and this is also true, without nuclear, without coal, and without natural gas today, wind would not be enough, and we could not deploy enough wind, which can't be dispatched, and by that we mean you can't turn it on or turn it off. It produces when Mother Nature says it's going to produce. We wouldn't be able to have as much as we have on the system today. So short term, what good looks like for us is adding more renewable energy, working on energy efficiency and demand response and how we interact with consumers, and taking that fossil presence ever more and more down as the technology develops and as we can deploy renewables.
As a journalist, I have to say what a treat it is to have a fact checker at my disposal.
Yes. Well, I'd be glad to interrupt a bit. There was a Congressional Budget Office estimate. The most recent that I could find quickly was in 2016, maybe a little bit dated, but I can see where this assertion would come from. Nearly $11 billion went toward renewable energy. It was the top expenditure in the energy sector. $2.7 billion for energy efficiency and electricity transmission, $4.6 billion for fossil fuels, the budget office said. That report, however, this goes on to show, didn't include dollars for every program. Notably, it didn't include all of the research programs, tax breaks that apply more broadly to industry, on something called depletion allowances. I'm not sure that I know enough about that, or the value of leasing on federal lands for coal, oil, or gas extraction. So there probably are some other dollars that would change that calculation. And since I have the mic here, I might also, I also see where Chuck was going. There was a American Wind Energy report that came out that, if I can find it here again, very much backed up the idea that right now the levelized cost of energy from different sources in 2020, taking into account subsidies, showed that wind and solar are the least expensive investment to be made. So it's true that there's more expenditure that's happening from the tax base. The other fact check that I was asked about, I can just clean my deck, was early on about the article, the Harvard article that suggested that there would be more land needed for the development of wind and solar that would be the only energy resource. And what the intent of that article, in looking at it, suggests is, it does say it would require 5 to 20 times more land area than previously thought. And the reason is because there's more evidence coming online about how wind turbines themselves interact with wind turbines in what's called a shadow, a wind shadow. So I think it's more the article was trying to suggest that the planning efforts for things like wind and solar, we're learning more as things go. And if you want to look up that article, the professor has been doing this research since 2013, David Keith.
So if I could say, thank you so much, by the way. Yeah, the point of the article was to look at the impact of more wind turbines economically, environmentally. And it was stated clearly that you would need to cover a third of America with wind turbines to replace conventional energy, so conventional produced electricity. So whatever the purpose of the article, still the statement that they reported in this peer-reviewed article was that you'd require a third of America's landmass to be covered with wind turbines. The article, the piece on subsidies by specific source, if you were to Google search EIA federal subsidies by source, the second item is titled Direct Federal Financial Interventions and Subsidies in Energy in Fiscal Year 2016. So it's an EIA document. You were looking at the congressional one. This from EIA breaks it down by source.
James, isn't that misleading, though, if you don't look at the collective lifetime of the asset? I mean, nuclear early on was a military asset, and I believe the Navy first developed nuclear energy. There's a lot of government spending on it. If you look at the life cycle of the asset, I think you'd come up with very different figures.
Well, if you're looking at what we are right now today subsidizing, it's wholly disproportionate for wind and solar power.
That doesn't account for the history, though.
And if you're looking at years past. Now, this has been the case. It's not just in 2022 or 2021. It goes back, I forget the year in which the wind production tax credit was first enacted, but this has been going on for more than a decade. And by the way, the wind turbines are rated for about 20, 25 years, same thing with solar panels. So I don't think it's misleading at all. I think it's still going to be that there is a dramatic disproportionality in subsidies for wind and solar power, but really the core of the issue, which I hope we can agree on, because I think Dominique and I did, is that we shouldn't have subsidies anyway. We wouldn't have to engage in these debates as to which one is benefiting over time, over history, if we eliminate subsidies altogether, which I think is a good solution.
James, have you ever been to Denmark and seen the wind turbines they have?
I've not been to Denmark.
It generates 50% of Denmark's wind energy needs, and it's barely a scant percentage of the landmass of Denmark.
So I can tell
Partly
you that,
because there's a significant offshore.
so I can tell you that electricity prices in Denmark are much higher than they are in the United States. And also, when we talk about Europe, one thing that broke my heart, last November, I was in Europe. I was in Scotland at the United Nations Climate Conference, and then we co-hosted a climate conference in Germany a week later. And as I was flying back to the United States, I had a flight change in Portugal. And as the plane was flying over Portugal, I just love looking at the lay of the land. And Portugal is very developed along the coast. It's just total wall-to-wall development. And a little bit inland, I'd have to guess because I'm looking out the window of the airplane, maybe 30, 40 miles inland. You could tell that you had this hilled, ancient forest, undisturbed, undeveloped forest that had existed for such a long time. And I say had existed because that was no longer the case. Looking out the window, all I saw was wall-to-wall wind turbines. Europe doesn't have many places where you have preserved nature, where you have ecosystems still existing as they have been from time immemorial. And Portugal just sacrificed theirs, which had to be one of the best ones left, one of the most extensive ones left for wind turbines. And I know their thoughts, their intent was in the right place, but I don't think it was necessary, and it had tragic consequences.
I'd like to switch the topic finally to my softball, which is...
Can I just clarify one thing?
Okay,
really
go.
quickly?
And then I'm going to get to my softball.
I wasn't really arguing for no subsidies at all. I was saying that if you were going to look at the history of subsidization of gas and oil, then you need to, think about that. So, sorry.
So you're agreeing with what I said? You look at
Correct.
the
I'm
life cycle.
right. I am agreeing with that. Yes.
Thank you. Chuck, before I get interrupted again, I'd like to just ask about your embrace of EV charging stations. Again, this is something you would expect in California or in a more liberal area than in red state Kansas and Missouri. On a per capita basis, if I understand it, you deployed more EVs charging stations than most utilities. And this gets to the question of corporate initiative and leading the public to a better place. How did you get there, and explain what your vision for that program has been?
Well, so I think this might be a place where we could agree a little bit. We did a pretty significant cost study, and there were a couple things that became very obvious to us about electric vehicle charging. One, the levelized cost of ownership, since we've thrown that term out there, for an electric vehicle is significantly less than it is for an internal combustion engine, and there's less maintenance on it, less fuel, the fuel is less costly, and it is also, there's less maintenance on it. Now, it is subsidized, obviously. Electric vehicles come with a nice hefty tax incentive from the government. So that may be a place where we might have some policy differences, but once you own the vehicle, it's less costly to own. So we want consumers who want that and also are concerned about the environment to have the ability to do it. And the biggest impediment to that is the availability of charging stations. The other thing, though, that we felt very strongly about is it is true that if we just dump all this increased load or demand on the system, and we don't think about how we use it and set up a system so that people can use it smarter, then we run the risk of exacerbating a problem already, which is adding to peak demand between 3, 4, 5, 6 o'clock. And so we wanted to gather real data. Nowhere in the United States, I think to this day, is there a single owned and operated system in a metropolitan area like this where you can see just exactly who's charging and when, not literally who, but that they're people charging, how they use it, and start to design programs and systems to help people, manage their usage a little bit better so we don't exacerbate a problem as we electrify. Look, we can argue all day about climate change. We can argue all day about whether electric vehicles are good or bad. The fact of the matter is that the big OEMs, the big auto manufacturers, they've made this decision. They're going to that platform. It's not going to be Tesla anymore. It's all the big three, and European automakers have all decided to get very, very serious about this, invested billions of dollars, and so this is coming. The only question is, in my mind, how do we deal with it? Do we exacerbate a problem or help fix and make the grid more efficient? And for us, It was a very small investment relative to the other investments we make, could help us gather a lot of data and really grow this the right way.
Dominique,
You know, actually, can I cut in? We just have a whole bunch of questions somewhat
just
related.
1 second, please.
Okay.
Dominique, you want to weigh in on the question of how we design our cities and the role of EV charging?
So, I mean, there are a lot of ways that we can integrate EV charging. I mean, it is absolutely a very complex issue. I just want to kind of shift for a moment, if I can, and just say, you know, the single most important thing that we can do, the list was great in the fact sheet, but is we have a singular opportunity right now to pass some legislation that would make a massive impact, the Build Back Better bill. And if this doesn't get passed, we're not going to have another opportunity to make this level of impact on our climate for a very, very long time, potentially. So that is some legislation that will potentially put millions of people to work. It will save, I think it was 5 billion tons of carbon. You can fact check that one. From our atmosphere and get us on track to what we need to be doing. So I think this was a talk about climate change and the issues that we have in front of us and what we can control, right, as individuals, right? And sure, I have an electric vehicle and I worry about the power grid that's going to be charging that. But the one thing I really can do is call my legislature, and I can call Congress, and I can say, please pass this legislation that will holistically look at this issue and work with utilities and work with the public market and work with private market and make, if we don't pass this bill, it could potentially reduce 90% of our chance of actually achieving the goals that we need to set. So I just needed to say that.
Let's go to the roving reporter, Madison.
Okay, go ahead, Madison.
Great. We've actually got quite a few related to somewhat of that. A lot of people are asking questions. I'll combine a bit about solar panel and accessibility of, you know, getting to green solutions on a more personal level and what sort of roadblocks we might run into here, whether that be, you know, powers that are contradicting sort of laws being passed or accessing this from a, you know, financial level. What sort of communities can get solar panels? What sort of requirements need to be done at a more local level? So I think to combine it would be, what do we need to see outside of the federal side, but, you know, either at the state or local level to expand access to sustainable solutions and also make them more accessible to people who might not be able to afford them currently?
And to put a spin on that last question, and we can go to Chuck first, the state of California has adopted targets for solar generation and for energy storage. Would Evergy like to see that in Kansas and Missouri?
Well, kind of hearkening back to something that was said earlier, you know, we're a monopoly. We don't, you know, if you're an Evergy customer, here you're Board of Public Utilities customer, you don't have a choice. And so, no, we're not super favorable on mandating things. Within our ecosystem, we like to present customers with choices in how they manage their electricity. I'm actually not averse to deregulating it and having it completely free choice, but that's not the decision policymakers have made in these states. Having said all that, I do think that there are significant barriers and policy considerations to a bunch of these technologies, whether it's battery storage, whether it's solar, and most people don't realize when somebody puts a solar installation on their home, it doesn't actually take money out of Evergy's pocket. So we're not against solar per se. What we are against, though, and what we do think needs to be considered is this system is paid for by everybody. And when somebody decreases their use in the system in between rate cases, that's going to cause rates to go up for others. And so there may be somebody in the audience tonight that can't afford solar. Well, your bill shouldn't get bigger because somebody else put solar on. And if you can't access it because you're in an area that won't accommodate it, you know, from an equity perspective, you shouldn't be disadvantaged. So I think some of those things are things we're going to have to deal with from a policy perspective, because the regulatory system as it's set up today absolutely hurts customers who do not have solar the more and more people go on the off the grid, so to speak. It's not really off the grid, as you know, but it is reducing their bill through a solar installation. It's something we'd like to see. It's just something that has some effects from a policy perspective we need to deal with.
Okay, Dominique and James, there are some communities that have utilities like Evergy and a regulatory climate like Kansas, Missouri. I'm thinking of Illinois, where they're experimenting with community solar. Can you talk a little bit about that as an option?
I'll go first if you like, but I'm going to take it a little bit in a different direction as I answer it. In Illinois, by the way, the economists, utilities are warning that there's going to be rolling brownouts this summer because we don't have enough electricity supply, and largely because legislation was passed last year in the Illinois State Legislature to eliminate coal fire plants by 2035 and natural gas power plants by 2045. You take electricity production offline, this is what you get. But I also want to, I know this discussion was billed as one about climate change, and the term solution has been used a few times regarding solar power and others. And I'm just thinking solution implies a problem. If you think there's a climate crisis, if you do, I want to challenge you with an open mind. Do you think so because you've looked at the scientific data, and there's quite a bit out there, or because you've heard other people say it? Do you think we're facing a climate crisis because you've heard that the 10 hottest years in history occurred this past decade? Do you think we're facing a climate crisis because you hear that hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires are all getting much worse? Do you believe so because you've heard that temperatures are rising faster than predicted? If you've heard any of those things, what if any of them weren't true? What if they all weren't true? The data has contradicted each and every one of those assertions. So
James,
my point is that...
If I could just interject to really help clarify and sharpen your point here. I assume you had a chance to look at the fact sheet prepared for this event. And it states, it refers to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was set up in 1988. I'm sure you're aware of its work. In February, just a few months ago, it said the science of climate change is settled. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, I disagree with that. Let's also talk a few
One more
points.
question, and then I'll give you the floor.
Well, if you
And
ask me a
that-
question for one
I'm
word,
gonna
I'd
ask
like
you-
to
Well, this is in
explain a
response
little bit.
to what you said, and I'll give you the
Okay.
floor. This morning, the New York Times, which I consider the best newspaper in the world, and I have a training as a journalist, I have a master's degree, like our fact checker.
You're
from
one of the few who believe in
one
the
of
New
the
York
best
Times is an
journalism
accurate
schools
reporter.
in the world. And it talks about climate change and warming of the planet. And it concludes by saying, the influence of global warming on heat waves, which is getting exponentially worse than in human history, and then even in geological history, is now becoming an obsolete question. In other words, it's universally agreed by every scientist.
Sure, that's what the
Now
New
you
York
have the
Times
floor.
says. Thank you. That's what the New York Times says. If you were to go to climateataglance.com, that is a
Excuse
book
me,
that-
the New York Times.
I thought I had the floor.
The New York Times
I
didn't
thought I
say
had
it.
the floor.
They quoted an expert.
I thought I had the floor.
You gotta let people finish and not interrupt. When they're in mid-sentence, we're gonna let them finish what they're saying, okay?
Yes, thank you. So if you were to go to climateataglance.com, you can find it on your cell phone. What you'll find, we at the Heartland Institute, we put together the evidence, the data you can find for yourself. If you look at heat waves, for example, a New York Times reporter asserting that heat waves are exponentially worse than ever before, that's not scientific evidence. But the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration produces data historically, and their data show that heat waves were significantly more frequent and severe, especially during the 1930s, but really throughout the first half of the 20th century. That's a fact. The IPCC, as you mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what they produced in their 2018 report, they stated that they have low confidence of any increase in the frequency or severity of hurricanes. In fact, it might even be in the other direction. That's what they say. They say they have low confidence of any increase in the frequency and severity of tornadoes. In fact, the data show they're becoming less frequent and severe. They say that they find that there is an increase in precipitation throughout the mid-latitudes, and they can't find any evidence of a decrease in precipitation elsewhere. That's the facts, that's the data. So if you have the people who write the report saying the science is settled, well, then the science is settled that we haven't seen any increase in these events. But I don't think the science is settled, even if they've made those statements that back up the scientific evidence that I've been stating.
You know, we have a
James, so you
question
might
that's
be
related to
saying
that. Go ahead.
It sounded a little bit to me like you were talking about weather events, not climate. And climate is really something that is over time. So if you look at the average temperature of the Earth over the last 40 years, it has risen 1.24% degrees, I believe, Fahrenheit. So it's increased at a faster rate than it did since 1880. Which has also steadily been increasing since the Industrial Revolution. So, yes, that you have those isolated patterns, right? But the overall trend is irrefutable. And if you look also at, like, here in Kansas City, I mean, we take this very seriously because we're, I think, the 5th most vulnerable area in the country in terms of climate change, because we're starting to see it. And I don't need to go to a website to know that my basement is flooding that's never flooded before, because precipitation levels are a lot heavier than they used to be over the course of the year and the years, right? So there's absolutely very clear evidence in terms of changes to the climate. And I think that's really important to define weather versus climate.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, Dominique, thanks. I brought those up because those are frequently the arguments that are most made for that we're facing a climate crisis. Hurricanes are getting more frequent and severe, tornadoes are getting more frequent and severe, droughts, wildfires. But the data show that's not the case. And that's what I want you to go find the data. Now, temperatures, are they rising? Actually, it's not 1 point something degrees in 30 years. It's about 0.4 degrees, maybe 0.5 degrees, but regardless. But again, the context is very important. The fact that temperatures are rising, some. Temperatures have in the past risen some, they've fallen some. That happens. That was before coal power plants and SUVs. But I think the most important point when we talk about temperatures and temperature trends and rising temperatures is the overall context. And what we know, the United Nations in its very first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report showed this. For the vast majority of the time that human civilization has existed, temperatures have been warmer than today. Temperatures right now that have been warming for the past century, they're warming because we're coming from the depths of the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was the coldest period of the past 10,000 years, and it's a good thing the Little Ice Age ended. So yes, I agree with you. Temperatures are rising. That's the trend. It's a good thing. We have to keep rising at this pace for a couple centuries before we reach temperatures that were benevolent enough for humans with much less technology than we have today for human civilization to develop and flourish.
Thank you. Jensen, I don't know if you can type fast enough or if you have it in
There's been a lot of good ones here. I did go ahead and check, because I thought that that we had a discussion about heat waves now versus heat waves in the 30s. I was able to find from the EPA some guidance on both of those periods. If you go to the climate indicators section of EPA.gov, you'll find that longer-term records show that heat waves in the 1930s remained the most severe in recorded U.S. history. It goes on to say heat waves that are occurring more often, or that are occurring now, are more often than they used to be in major cities across the United States. The frequency has increased steadily from an average of 2 heat waves per year during the 1960s to 6 during the year in 2010, and that they last a day longer than the average heat wave did prior to the 1960s. It says that the intensity was related, in the 30s, was related to poor land practices, a period that I think we colloquially know as the Dust Bowl, where persistent heat waves were the result of intense drought. depleting soil moisture and reducing moderating effects of evaporation.
Thank you, Jensen. We're going to go to Madison for some questions.
Thank you. Yeah, this is related to kind of what you've been sharing. James, it's to make it clear is where do you stand on the need for limiting carbon emissions?
Okay, and by the way, if you go to climateataglance.com, we have a page on heat waves. You probably can't see it very well here, but this is a chart that shows the frequency and severity of heat waves going back over 100 years. This is from actual data.
So,
EPA
James,
can say what they want, but this is actual
cut
data.
this discussion off because it's beyond the scope of our evening to discuss whether heat waves are a factor or not.
That was just brought up, so I just thought I would mention.
I think we've aired the controversy. And to have the final last word, I invite you all to look at page A4 in this article.
I invite you to look at climateataglance.com for the actual data, not the New York Times' opinions.
It's not a New York Times opinion piece. It's an article quoting sources.
Can we take another question from the audience?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, we've got, let me find yours.
Yes, I'll be happy to
Dominic,
answer the question.
Hold on.
Yes.
Dominic, do you want
She
to
asked me a
talk about
question.
emissions?
About
Yeah, do you want to talk about
Emissions.
that, carbon emissions?
I think the way that we think about this is that we need to get to carbon neutral buildings by 2030. So whether that's through community solar, which was one of the options that you mentioned earlier that we didn't really get to talk about, sorry about that, but, or, you know, reduction, it's a combination, right, of reducing the overall load of the building through better technology, better efficiency, better management of the systems, and then using renewables as the last resort to that, because we do agree that if we don't try to do the reduction first, then that's not necessarily the most efficient outcome either. So,
Chuck, do you want to talk about emissions and what the utility feels about where it's headed?
We're very public. We have said we'll be net zero, carbon neutral by 2045. These are just facts. 50% under 2005 levels today, 70% by 2030. In the last, between 2012 and 2020, we've added 4,500 megawatts plus or minus of renewable energy and retired 2,500 megawatts of fossil. We cannot eliminate it all today, but we are on a path. We are on a path that is quicker than almost all of our neighbors, with one exception. We intend to continue on that path. The last mile, so to speak, of carbon neutrality, though, doesn't get there from just the utility. It has to be consumer involved, it has to be buildings, it has to be transportation, we're talking about changing a whole bunch of different systems, but it doesn't have to be a net negative. There are some real issues, and James is correct. If we try and do that too quickly, we will have reliability issues, which is where Evergy gets whipsawed, because probably 75% of you in this room right now and watching on TV at home, I know TV isn't a thing anymore, but I like to think of it as TV, you would probably say we're not moving quickly enough, and 25% would probably say we're doing way too much. Probably the truth, somewhere in the middle, but what I will tell you is the reason we are seeing some issues around reliability today is the issue of having enough dispatchable generation. Today, it doesn't have to be that way forever, and our position, going back to your question, is we are trying to reduce and have a plan to reduce our carbon footprint.
James, a question for you. Does the market have a role to play to reduce emissions?
I think if the market were respected, what we would see is the most affordable, abundant energy sources rising to the top, and that would be a wonderful thing. The market's not allowed to operate because we have this agenda right now to reduce carbon dioxide emissions when we're not facing a climate crisis. Look at the evidence, and you can see for yourselves. But even if you believe that we are facing such a crisis, the path that we're taking is the reason why we're paying $5 a gallon for gasoline. It's the reason why we're going to have rolling brownouts in Illinois. They're warning about rolling blackouts in Michigan this year. It used to be when these happened in California, we said, well, that's just California. I mean, we expect them to do that to themselves. But now we don't have a choice. And this is what happens when you impose these restrictions on carbon dioxide without a plan to have affordable, abundant energy in its place.
Yeah, I'm sure we have something kind of related to that. You know, considering the emissions that result from the manufacturing process, is it a good idea to build a new ballpark in Kansas City right now to replace a perfectly good one? Do cities need to get more serious about these decisions right now?
I think that's a really, really interesting question. I think it gets to something that we could really analyze and be pretty smart about in terms of operational versus embodied carbon. So when we look at how much carbon is maybe generated, the impacts of all those cars driving to the current location of the ballpark versus how many people we could get to the ballpark through public transportation if it was in a downtown central location. You could probably do the math and see, you know, versus if you built it in a very sustainable, smart way, what would the carbon, the embodied carbon from all those materials cost. So I think it would be a really interesting calculus to do, but I think there's a way to do it where it would come out on the plus side for sure.
Another one?
Yeah, great, we can always find other ones. Are there alternatives to time of day rates? And if so, what are the pros and cons of each?
So we have a rate review filed right now in Missouri. We'll have another one in Kansas next year. And I think in those filings, we have about a dozen different rate structures we're going to propose to the regulatory commissions and ask them to approve at least on a pilot basis, meaning getting back to choice. We want customers to do what they want to do. So everything we've asked for low income rates, different time of use rates. We've asked for flat rates, a subscription fee. If I ask you folks to raise your hand, most of you would have a streaming service. That's a subscription rate. One price, stream as much as you want. We can do that for electricity as well. Now, there may be a few environmentally minded people out there that say, that sounds like a horrible idea. One rate, all you can eat, people will go crazy. Well, that would cost us money the way we've designed it. And so that would come packaged with a programmable thermostat. That would come packaged with perhaps some power storage. That would probably come with some strings attached, all designed to help you use less electricity so we didn't face that eventuality, but it would give you some bill security and predictability as well. So there are pros and cons to every single way you design a rate. The rates today that exist have pros and cons to them. So we don't want to see it mandated. We want to see people have options, and we also want to look and make sure that folks, and this is in this region, depending on what part of the region you're in, is anywhere between 18 and about 23% of the population are significantly challenged from a financial perspective. We want to make sure that we have some rates that reflect that as well.
So just on that point, I happened to interview the CEO of the main utility in Chicago, Com Edison, Gil Quinones, and they're very focused up there on the question of equity, which you know is starting to become very important in the utility sector. The whole notion, and you talked about not using innovations on the energy front to get more sustainability in a way that harms people that can't afford it. Are there any new approaches to equity here in Kansas City you'd like to discuss?
Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that if you want to talk about equity that we should be thinking about. But in terms of just energy pricing, one of the things that we hear quite a bit is, well, if you're going to give a different rate, for example, for an individual that's low income, that's not fair. That means other people are going to subsidize it. And then there we go with that S word again. But the fact of the matter is that lower income consumers often, not always, but a majority of the time, have a more energy-intense existence, meaning it costs them more because they have older technology, older, leakier, less insulated buildings, cars that aren't brand new and super economic and efficient. And so when you talk about wallet share, the share of a lower income individual's wallet that goes to things like that, it's going to be more because they use more. Well, the same argument that we use for big industrial consumers, which is you use a ton of electricity, so you shouldn't have quite as high a rate as somebody else. Why can't we flip the script and say, for certain individuals at a certain portion of the poverty level, they already pay the fixed cost of the system because they're using more electricity than perhaps someone like Dominique or me, who, you know, obviously are very aggressive about the technology that we employ to reduce our footprint. So again, shouldn't be for everybody, and that's just one little slice of the way to look at it, and it probably isn't the right solution, just a part of the solution to consider.
James, I want to ask you a question to get back, because we only have a few minutes left here, that gets to the politics of Mother Nature. You head up a think tank that has a distinct point of view and a position on a number of issues, and you articulated them tonight. There are other think tanks and organizations on various sides of the debate. Do you see any way to get past these balkanized positions and have people collaborate on approaches to some of these pressing problems?
It'd be nice. I think the greatest challenge facing our country today isn't a particular issue. It's our ability to express differences, to explore different points of view in a way that respects each other as people. I have a particular point of view that focuses on individual freedom because I think that's the best means by which we're going to have a society in which people are happiest, healthiest, that they have more enjoyment. Other people believe there are other ways to get there. If somebody believes in a larger government focus and different policy paths, that doesn't mean they're a bad person, and I hope the same is said about me. It's funny, I go to a cigar lounge occasionally. My best friend he's a very strident Democrat, center-left, and we love each other, and we engage in these discussions. We talk about a lot of things, including politics. And every now and then it gets a little heated, and I'll just stop and say, Ro, but you know I love you, man, right? And that pretty much puts it in perspective. That's what we have to do. People get fired up about global warming. I get fired up on my point of view. People get fired up on the other side. Other issues, no matter what it is. But remember, with few exceptions, people hold different positions because they think that's the best way we are going to be happiest as a society. And for that, we shouldn't hate each other.
Just to kind of follow up on the diversity
Yeah.
kind of question, though, I do want to say that I think you hold a very privileged position, right, with your opinions, as do I, as do all of us up here on this panel, right? And what's going on with our climate crisis is affecting women, children, people who are not even in the United States, right, who are affected by what we do as in terms of our industries, and certainly people who are, you know, living in poverty inordinately, and for us to say, well, you know, I have my opinion and I want to have that opinion when the effects of those opinions are affecting other people negatively every day. And there's studies that also show tens of thousands of people will die due to what's happening with climate change, right? This is a public health issue. It's not, I want my opinion issue. People are dying. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Republican who I respect deeply, made that point in California years ago. And I thought that was really, really interesting that was his approach, was let's think about how all of these policies are actually affecting the air quality, are affecting the water, are affecting, you know, what we're paying in terms of just the cost of mitigating climate change in terms of public health will pay for all of the mitigation, and according to also other studies. So I just needed to say that also.
Can I respond to that? So you think that policies with which you disagree are responsible for all sorts of deaths. And I'm quite convinced that your policies would be responsible for all sorts of deaths. We do know there was a peer-reviewed study in The Lancet. It's the most prestigious medical science journal in the world. I believe it was 2015. And the scientists looked at how many people are dying from temperatures that are less than optimal. And what they found is that for every one person around the globe, so we're talking the globe like you said, who dies because they're exposed to temperatures that are too warm, 19 people die from being exposed to temperatures that are too cold. So on top of that, just another point of perspective. When I was a boy growing up, I was raised by a single parent in the housing projects. And we talked about equity and energy. Equity and energy for me is this. When I was a kid and there was a heat wave, and there were heat waves in the 1970s before the planet started warming, there were nights when I could not sleep because it was so darn hot and we didn't have air conditioning. We couldn't afford air conditioning. There were winter evenings when it was so darn cold, when I'm sleeping under 3 blankets with my head completely enclosed under the blankets and I have to pull my head up to breathe every few minutes because we couldn't afford to have heat. There are a lot of people in this country for whom the price and availability of energy is an equity issue. And I feel for them. I was one of them. There are a lot of factors involved, but Dominique, you believe that my policies hurt people and kill people. I believe your policies hurt people and kill people. We have to respect each other as individuals and not say, well, your position's bad, you must be a bad person, you're not entitled to respect. We have to do that as a society.
So for the final section, so now what? We've raised a variety of issues, and I'd like to start with Chuck and go down the row here. Is there anything you heard tonight that you think is actionable for you in your work or for the audience when they take home in terms of researching these issues? Where do we go from here?
You know, interestingly enough, I mean, that's what every day is for me. It's action. We are trying to listen to customers who have very differing opinions on what's good for them and what they want. And we are trying to work within the construct that we have in Kansas and Missouri to provide them choice and to try and find some consensus. Again, that for us, it's an all of the above kind of a solution. There's no bad idea. I will tell you, Marty, I've been involved now with energy for about 20 years, at KCP&L, now Evergy, for 15. About 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I decided to stop doing these conversations. And the reason that I didn't do panel discussions is because nobody ever agreed. It always got acrimonious. We started throwing facts at each other. People walk away and get upset, and not one damn thing gets done that advances an understanding, and it advances something productive for society, for, in this case, just for the metropolitan area. And I will tell you, I think it's because people sometimes stop looking at the goals and they start just drinking from the cause Kool-Aid, right? It's my cause. It becomes like a religion on both sides. But if we think about it, we don't want mass extinction. Nobody here wants people disproportionately and negatively impacted by the environment. We want equity. We want good health. We want quality of life. Those are all goals we share. So if we can solidify around those goals and understand that nobody here is going to get 100% of what they want when they want it, that's called life. At least that's what my mama said. Then maybe we can start looking where there's overlap and progressing. It'll always be too slow for some and too fast for others. In the meantime, what do? We're going to keep trying to give you options on energy efficiency, electric vehicles. we are going to, despite folks calling us murderers, we're going to continue to operate our coal plants until there's a viable other alternative or nuclear power that means we can still have lights in this region. We're never going to be right for 90% of our customers, because none of our customers think just like I do or think just like their neighbor. And so I do hope we can find some common ground. But I did this for an old friend. I got to see some old friends. And I hope we can just keep progressing on solutions and the goals, not necessarily the cause.
I think that was very well said, Dominique and James. Is there anything you want to add that goes beyond that?
Well, I'll just say that I hope everyone in the audience, live and online on video, will go to climateataglance.com if you are interested anyway in climate change. Each of our summaries on 30 climate change topics, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires, you name it. And each and every summary, it's about 2 pages apiece, so it's not going to go over your head. It's not going to take a 2-hour commitment. And it's presenting NASA data, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data, National Weather Service data. Everything there is backed up by the facts. Read it. Read it with an open mind. If you don't find it compelling, that's fine, but I think you will. So I hope you do that.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
Lauren?
Thanks, Marty. Good evening. My name is Lauren Weinhold. I'm the Director of Development at APS. I, again, want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our panelists for this spirited discussion. And also extend a special thank you to our fact checker, Jensen, and our fabulous roving reporter, Madison. Madison, where are you? Yay. Thank you so much. I want to again thank all of our sponsors who made this evening's conversation possible, and a special thank you to Monsignor Sweatland, Dr. Flans, and Donnelly College for hosting us this evening. Thank you for your hospitality. Tomorrow, you're going to receive an email with a link to a short survey. I implore you to fill that out and share your feedback with us, because it will absolutely shape future programming. So be on the lookout for that email to come tomorrow. APS relies on the support of its members to engage, educate, and convene like we've done tonight. So thank you to our members who are with us tonight. We know that you have a choice in how you spend your time and your resources, and we're honored that you chose to spend it with us. If you are not yet a member of APS and you found this evening's conversation meaningful or perhaps challenging, I invite you to join us as a member tonight. You can visit AmericanPublicSquare.org or simply stop and see Cindy as you leave, and she'll get you signed up. And as a small token of our appreciation when you join this evening, you'll also receive one complimentary membership to share with someone you think would find the work of APS meaningful. I would be remiss also if I didn't mention that during the month of May, thanks to an incredibly generous APS board member, we are in the midst of a challenge match. So know that any gift you make to APS before the end of the month will be matched dollar for dollar. On behalf of our founder, Alan Katz, our executive director, Claire Bishop, and the entire APS team, thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you at future programs. In the meantime, be well and be kind.